Hello, I'm Sophia Besch, and this is The World Unpacked. So, today we're talking about climate change. We're talking about how the effects of climate change pose systemic risks to the global economy and how paying attention to financial issues in this context can potentially change policy. And we're going to talk about all this using the example of climate-related flooding and the housing market. And let me try to set the scene a little bit here. The effects of increasing heat, rising sea levels are becoming impossible to ignore. They're reshaping lives. We have arrived at the point of the climate crisis where governments will have to come up with strategies to relocate millions from coastal regions in the coming decades because sea levels are going to rise. They're already rising with remarkable speed. And this is not just true for island states in the global south. I mean, this is true for the US, where millions of homes are at risk. And the government is also facing mounting disaster relief costs with each recurring major flood that we're going to see. And housing is central to the US economy. Climate-related disruptions could lead to rising mortgages, declining home values, more financial instability, spillover effects felt around the world. And this does not just endanger homeowners, it also risks placing a massive strain on the financial system, not just in the US, but globally. We could essentially be talking about another housing market bubble here. So with all of that said, I'm so glad that today joining me is my colleague Susan Crawford, who's a senior fellow in the Sustainability, Climate and Geopolitics Program here at Carnegie. And I wanted to have Susan on because I'm so interested in how her work critically examines the intersection of climate change with power, climate change with justice, and at the same time is extremely practical and pragmatic. And Susan really focuses on what can be done, what governments and other institutions should do to craft policies that help humans lead thriving lives, even in the face of our rapidly changing climate. So Susan, welcome to The World Unpacked.
Thank you, Sophia. What a nice introduction and a terrific frame for this discussion.
Great. Then let's start with the 30,000-foot view, because this is a foreign policy podcast, and we want to make sure that we explain what the connections are between the work we do here at Carnegie and the housing market, the work we do here at Carnegie and flooding, right? So maybe we start out by, how did you become interested in the housing market as part of your work on climate change?
Well, the ferociously accelerating effects of climate change are felt around the world, and the U.S. is no exception. Although as humans, we tend to think that each storm, each flood, each wildfire is an anomaly, a blip in an otherwise serene existence. It's increasingly apparent that these effects are not only here, but they will continue to affect lives. And I've been extremely interested in the fact that our legal and financial systems are devoutly focused on keeping the status quo in place in the face of rapidly accelerating change. And I'm trained as a lawyer, I can't help it, and my focus has been domestic, although I look around the world at these issues. And I'm distressed at the systemic incentives to keep things exactly as they are, even as the world is changing rapidly. So that's where my interest comes from. I spent 4 years working on a book about Charleston, South Carolina, which is a terrific distillation of both power, a touristic area, 8 million tourists a year, an enormous amount of investment in keeping history in place that is threatened by dramatic sea level rise, and operating against a background of racial unfairness coming from the very beginning of the U.S.'s founding. The bill is coming due in Charleston, and I learned that story gradually, often by interviewing people who happened to be visiting, like Dutch scientists.
Right, the Dutch would know.
Dutch would know, and they took a look at Charleston. They were shocked at what they saw and had many suggestions for different governance regimes and systems of dealing with property that would help. Their interest was in protecting human lives and making sure that people can continue to thrive, which really is the word I like to use, no matter who you are. One thing that government should be doing is making it possible for you to live in safety and dignity. And a place that is chronically flooding is not a place for a dignified, safe life. It came to me gradually that nothing was going to change unless people with money began to care. In the abstract, there is no incentive for a local government official to do anything in particular to protect his people against, or her people against, rising sea levels. It's expensive, it's very difficult. Maybe somebody should move, as you suggested in your opening remarks, but boy, that's threatening because that would undermine property tax revenues, which are the basis for a lot of what cities do in America anyway. And so I began looking at ways that the private markets were sending signals about risk that, if understood by policymakers, should cause them to change how and where we live. Given leadership, which I know is a big assumption, and given a gradually spreading awareness of the physical risks of climate change, we have to lower emissions. That is not off the table. It's extremely important for the future of humanity. My research takes as a given that for the next century, these changes are baked in, and that nothing we do to lower emissions today would affect what's about to happen to 10,000 coastal cities around the world, and increasingly fierce wildfires that will afflict Southern Europe and Africa in ways that scientists can predict today. So have to lower emissions, but I'm focused on the Latin word for this is adaptation. What are the steps that governance systems need to take to ensure that people can lead safe and dignified lives?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for framing that so beautifully, because that allows us to then use this example of flood risks and sort of exercise what it might look like in practice, right? And in your research, you highlight that, floods obviously affect home values and that the housing finance system may currently not sufficiently account for these risks. Can you maybe just provide some context for our listeners on how the current flood insurance system in the U.S. functions and how flood risks are currently assessed and also communicated, I guess, to homeowners?
Every policy bullet point has a story behind it. And here, the story in the U.S. is that the private marketplace long ago retreated from selling flood insurance in America. They thought it was too risky. It just wasn't a business-like proposition. In exchange for stiff building requirements, the federal government stepped in the 60s to say, we're going to sell flood insurance. So more than 90%, probably 96% or more of flood insurance in America is sold by the federal government. You may be buying it from a private agent, but they're just a pass-through. They're getting a cut. They may get 30% of the premium in exchange for shuffling the paper around. But the risk really sits on the federal government's books. Until quite recently, that flood insurance was not matched to the actual risk of living in flood-risky areas. It was just provided based on maps of special flood hazard areas that the federal government had made up over time. The current system has lots of weaknesses. Often homeowners don't know that even if their property is outside the binary in-out of a map drawn by the federal government, it's still subject to flood risk. Often they don't know that the premiums they're paying are really very low in comparison to the risks. Often they don't know that those premiums cover only $250,000 of a home's value. And there aren't enough people buying flood insurance in America, even though it's mandatory right now for any mortgage to be sold on the secondary market. In the U.S., that's a federal instrumentality. Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac absorb about 70% of U.S. mortgages under a particular amount. In order to be absorbed by Fannie and Freddie in the U.S., you have to have flood insurance. Compliance, not complete. A lot of people research is divided on this, but many people may not be buying in. And we do see that take-up rates, that's the lingo for this, are low and getting lower for federal flood insurance. So what do we have? A big gap in disclosure, a big gap in coverage, and that shifts enormous risk onto individuals. We saw after Hurricane Harvey that something like 30 to 40% of the houses that were drenched by that hurricane did not actually have flood insurance. And especially if you're a low-income person, it's very difficult to survive, to sort of make it over the course of that storm into your next chapter of your life without insurance. So insurance is supposed to spread risk. It's not an entitlement necessarily. And right now, it's likely that it's being provided at less expense than it should be. It should be more expensive. It should be signaling risk more clearly. And more people should be in the pool so that the premiums both remain in the front of people's minds, everybody's aware of flood risk, and are spread among a very wide population. In the last few years, the federal government has taken a major step forward by ranking properties according to their actual flood risk, not on some binary map-driven standard, but by ingesting a lot of information from the private insurance market about risk, and they call this risk rating 2.0. So there is risk-adjusted insurance gradually coming online in the United States, but still disclosure's awful, take-up rates are low, and people are exposed to rapidly increasing costs of insurance, which particularly for low-income people may cause them not to be able to afford their houses in the long run. So it's a big problem.
It is a big problem. And just for me to understand, I understand the part of the equation of homeowners not actually taking up insurance because they don't understand the risks or because it is too expensive, too intransparent. If I do have flood insurance right now, to what extent does that actually protect me from, how much is it are the actual costs and risks baked into the insurances that do exist?
Well, this is called the National Flood Insurance Program. And one thing you need to know about it is that it keeps having to borrow money from Congress. It had to borrow $20 billion in 2017 following Hurricane Harvey. So it's precarious, and it is limited in its coverage. So if your house is worth more than $250,000, you won't get the full replacement value of a house. Many people are surprised by that. They don't understand that the coverage is low. And it is unlikely, if you're not in a flood zone as you think you understand it, that you actually have flood insurance. Because right now, it's a choice for people whose mortgages aren't being absorbed by that Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac system I talked to you about. And for people who don't have mortgages, maybe they don't have any flood insurance at all. So take-up rates are low, probably even for you. So if you had it, it might be insolvent. If you had it, it might not cover the coverage value of your home. And if you had it, the long-term sustainability of that insurance is uncertain.
I have to say, the more setup we do, the more I struggle to see a way out of this other than move. But we'll get there, I'm sure. Before we do that, I wanted to ask you how these problems in the U.S. compare to other regions in the world. You already mentioned the Netherlands as one country that obviously has a lot of experience with flood risks. But talk to us more about, you said coastal cities globally are affected by this.
It's interesting. I've been looking at other countries, and almost, in fact, nobody except for the U.S. has taken this step into rating homes according to their actual physical risk. There's an idea, especially in Europe, of mutuality, where no matter where the home is, everybody has the same quantum of risk perceived because of where they are. Just because of being in a country, you're told you'd have a particular assessment of risk by that country. This, from an American standpoint, this seems bananas because you should have some response. It could be a big country, and you should have responsibility for where you live. Perhaps you should have to pay more if you live in a riskier place. But if you put a different, maybe Netherlandish hat on, you would say, well, actually, it's the government's responsibility to limit building in floodplains. And what the U.S. has done is essentially create a moral hazard, allowing building in unsafe places and maybe even encouraging it by making available flood insurance for those areas. I told you that the initial deal in the 60s was that there was a trade-off. You get steep building codes and rules, and in exchange for that, we're going to create federal flood insurance. That deal was rolled over in the course of time. So the building codes are, the requirement, the stick, has essentially vanished, very low level of requirements coming from the federal government, but the flood insurance part of the deal persists. And now many people see it as really an entitlement in the U.S.
No matter where I build.
No matter where you build or what you
insured.
do, especially development community, there should be insurance that should be available. It's the government's responsibility to make sure that insurance is there. It's a weirdly sort of socialistic, it's both socialistic and individualistic at the same time. I get to build wherever I want, and you, the government, FEMA, will show up no matter what if there's a disaster and take care of me. This is no way to keep people safe. What we should be doing is planning in advance for people to live in relatively less risky areas. And in those areas, a private insurance market will likely emerge. If it makes business sense for insurers to be there, they will. We're seeing insurance companies exit from places like Florida and California, replaced by more fly-by-night insurance companies, maybe not as solvent, maybe not as likely to be around in the long term. And it should not be that the answer is to just shore up that market by making sure there's some state insurance fund that's available. Because all you're doing is making a money machine roll that benefits developers, but in the long term doesn't benefit society.
And other countries approach this differently, as you said.
Yes.
The Netherlands, maybe more government in the early stages for actually allowing you where to build or not to build.
Especially the Netherlands is a real leader in that. They are so practical. They shrug and glare at you when you say we allow building in floodplains.
Yeah.
It just makes no sense to them. Now, maybe they have it's been described to me as a constitutional requirement that you not be at risk of anything greater than a 1 in 10,000 year flood in the Netherlands, that they build to a very, very high standard, and they market their engineering expertise around the world. They also will be overcome by flooding. They are actually at probably Charleston's at greater risk than the Netherlands, but they're at great risk from the North Sea spreading out over Amsterdam and Rotterdam. It might make more sense, and some elements of the Dutch government will even talk about this, to move to Germany, to have some, that's the joke line anyway, to have some efforts at concentrating development in the middle of the country rather than everything on the coasts. But for the moment, they too are dedicated to keeping the status quo in place. But their status quo is different than ours. They don't allow building on the margins, and they have extensive walling off of their coastline.
They have sea dams. Yeah. Can you just, before we move on, give us maybe a sense of scale of what this means for the U.S.? We've now we've talked about Florida, we've talked about California. Yeah. There's an awful lot of people who the government in your telling might have to say in the future, you're actually not supposed to build here. You're no longer going to be protected if you do.
Well, we'll see what happens. So right now in the U.S., we think somewhere between 17 to 20% of the housing stock overall in many parts of the country is exposed to high physical climate risk. Exactly. And that could be from wildfires, which are, accelerating in the Northeast as well as in California, and also from floods and rainstorms. Heavy rain is part of the problem too, and also hail and severe convective storms, tornadoes, are a big problem. But the 20% number is just flood and wildfire. And if that market suddenly woke up and repriced itself to reflect that climate risk, if in fact there was a discount for homes that weren't worth what the market now says they're worth because of climate risk, that could be something like a $1.7 trillion correction in housing prices in the United States. And as you said, the housing market is really central to a lot of the financial system in America. Many things spin off from it. Municipal bonds are based on property tax receipts. Mortgage-backed securities, a huge market, depends on property values. Local government finances depend on those property taxes being paid regularly to them. It is amazing how much of our governance depends on a steady drumbeat of payments that relate to housing. If pockets of that crumble across the United States, some researchers suggest that the effect will be akin to like a dozen great financial crises in different places in the country. Because at the same time, right now, housing values are going up in the United States. We're not building enough housing. House prices have climbed by 50% over recent years. In pockets of the U.S. where this risk is being seen, we're already seeing softening of property values. So not that they're not appreciating as quickly as non-risky houses is what we're seeing. That's being accompanied by non-renewals by private insurance companies of homeowners insurance in those areas. So the conditions for a softening of property values are being felt. The entire reason I'm looking into this is not just to warn people about moving away from risky areas themselves individually, but also to send signals to policymakers that this is really the time for courage to be brave, to put the risk on the table, to say our area is facing these risks and could, instead of constantly reacting and paying for disasters, pay $1 for every $13 of disaster recovery funding. In some cases, building, there might be some place for hard infrastructure along coasts, but more likely the solution for coastal flooding is actually just to back away from the coast steadily, with dignity, with a lot of respect for communities that are there. And the one way to do this might be to incentivize, subsidize, support building of dense, well-served by transit housing in relatively safer areas. So that's the overall direction I'm pushing for. But the way to get there, the only way that seems to speak to U.S. policymakers is through their pocketbooks, that it is actually a waste of government resources to continue to plop sand on beaches, to re-nourish them. That's the jargon for this. When that sand is then swept away 2 years later in a storm, to continue to allow people to build in risky areas, to continue to allow, shifting to wildfire for a second, homes to be built with vegetation very close to them or with fences that reach right to their neighbors, because that we know what limits spread of embers in wildfires. We know what building codes would help that. But it's difficult for policymakers to say we actually have to do that right now rather than waiting for some uncertain time in the future when somebody else will take care of it.
Okay, so I want to talk much more about what your conversations with governments actually look like and what you would recommend they do. But I just want to pause for a minute on what you were saying about the U.S. housing market and how that relates to the global economy.
Yes.
And to just really drill down on this point, we all had to learn a lot about the U.S. housing market about 15 years ago. And I drew that comparison early on in the setup for this conversation. You would, if I'm anywhere else in the world, should I also be worried about these insecurities built into the U.S. housing market and how that might affect the global financial system?
We certainly saw this in 2008. We live in a deeply interlinked, interconnected world where softness in the U.S. economy in 2008, driven by the housing market and mispricing of risk buried inside financial instruments, was suddenly repriced, leading to a liquidity crisis in the U.S., which then rippled across the world. The same conditions are being created now. We're seeing an increase in inventory of risky houses in the U.S. right now that looks like the situation in 2006, 2007. when similarly there were alarm signals being sent by local housing markets about foreclosure risk for people who'd gotten in over their heads on mortgages. That's what triggered the '08 crisis. Now we have people in over their heads for mortgages in risky areas where costs are accelerating for them, where they won't be able to keep up with their mortgages and at the same time may not be able to sell those houses at prices that will buy out their mortgages. So same thing being set up here. In fact, I often interview a guy named Dave Burt, who helped with some of the data in this paper, who has his own little company. And he certainly stands to benefit if this pays out, but the data he has is very strong. He was one of the people that helped create The Big Short in connection with the '08 crisis. He sees a similar bolus of risk being created in the housing market relating to mispriced climate risk. He would like to be able to bet against that, to short it, in essence. And he says that this research is aimed at convincing people to lower emissions, ultimately, that's the answer. Whatever his motives, the data he has are very strong, and the patterns, to me, seem reminiscent of the '08 crisis.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now to let people digest that, and then we'll be back in a minute to talk about what to do about all of these challenges with Susan Crawford.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. And we're back, and I'm speaking to Susan Crawford about what governments can do to make the housing market more resilient in the face of climate change, floods, fires, heavy rainfalls. Before we get into specific policies, Susan, what is your sense? How aware are governments, is the U.S. government, of the risks that you've outlined here today?
There's several answers to that question. I think everybody who reads a newspaper is aware that storms are hitting the United States, wildfires are horrifying, there is fear and terror everywhere. It is very difficult to shift from an apprehensive worldview the moment you see a story in the paper to genuine policy change at any level for local, state, federal officials. I have seen individuals in local government recognize the risks, but say that it is just too hard to work on these problems because everything's so interconnected. At the federal government level, we still do not have a shared sense that there's a connection between physical climate risk and financial risk and sort of stability of society. If anything, it's transmuted into some vague fear of migrants crossing our borders, which is, part of the issue, but does not reflect the panoply of risks to individual human lives and public health and everything else. So on the federal level, no planning energy yet to prioritize where the risks are greatest and to direct funding on a grand scale to places that need additional investment because they are safer. And that's what I'd like to see. a lot of reactive fundings. And again, I'm drawing a line here in between reacting to disasters on the one hand, which happens routinely, and planning ahead. When a disaster happens in the U.S., 30 federal agencies rush in, sometimes in uncoordinated fashion. But there is no federal agency that is responsible for looking ahead for the future of the country and figuring out where it would make sense to invest and where we might want to, in a dignified, graceful manner, gradually draw back from investments in order to encourage people to take on responsibility for living in safer places.
Yeah. I'm interested to hear you say that people still think about, the risks of climate disaster to population movement in the context of refugees and immigration.
Yeah.
I made this point in my introduction, but I do still find that people in wealthy Western countries struggle to see how climate change will affect them.
Yeah.
Most of them have understood that it will affect people somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But I think that's one reason why I think your work is so important, because you point out how it affects people, wealthy people in the United States, and not just those living by the sea, but also those who have any investment in the financial market.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Moving into what should be done, I took notes as you were talking earlier, and you were talking about transparency, right? Disclosing flood risks when you buy houses, disclosing flood risk in insurance coverage, which also I think you mentioned that would require better maps, more accurate maps of actually which houses, which regions are at risk. What other things would you like to see happen?
And to its credit, the federal government now makes available a tool that you can use to understand what your federal flood insurance premium will be for a particular house. And anywhere that house is, no matter where it is on a map, not within a line of special flood hazard area, but really anywhere. So that's a tremendous advance that has happened. But those higher premiums are being staged in over 18 years, so they are not hitting yet. So many people don't understand that. So in addition, and also to its credit, both NOAA, people in charge of weather data for the United States, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency have within them terrific data about what's going on, what's about to happen. What's missing is a risk assessment that is communicated clearly to the public, a sort of concerted view that these areas are increasingly risky and we should be planning accordingly. And it is that communication that I would like to see. We sort of have a pick your own risk approach in the U.S.
Yeah.
You're supposed to, almost as if it's up to individuals to decide what level of risk they're comfortable with.
Right. And then we blame them. I mean, you see this a lot in the response to the California wildfires, for instance. Why are these rich people building their houses where they shouldn't be building their houses?
Right. And there was a grand structure that led up to that allowed that to happen. And it is actually the role of government to have a view about where safe and unsafe areas are. So that's the first step: better transparency, better data, but most importantly, communicated clearly. And the second step would be genuine planning that might take a time horizon of 10 or 20 years. Difficult for elected officials because they'll be out of office, and if they start talking about this, they won't get reelected. But somebody has to be looking ahead and saying, for these particular areas, we should gradually withdraw from funding federal infrastructure in those places, utilities, streets, highways. It is amazing that the Northeastern Corridor for Amtrak runs in some of the most fragile areas of the East Coast, and will at some point have to shift. All right, let's plan for that. Let's talk about it and think about how that's going to happen. We're capable of great things as a country, but at the moment, there's no appetite for this kind of long-range concerted planning.
Right. So I wanted to ask you about where you see the obstacles to this. And in a way, I mean, you talked about it already. political election cycles. You call for courage, but this is going to be an unpopular issue to
Extremely.
bring up with voters. So where do you see, and this is a leading question, what makes you optimistic, but where do you see the opportunities for leaders to step up and do something about this?
Another special characteristic of our grand country here in America is that we have a very strange federal system in which a lot of the money is at the federal level, but the planning over land use is at the local level. So where I'm optimistic is the possibility for states, we were sort of in the middle of all this, to become engines of regional planning. The Dutch do this according to watershed regions. States could fill a role of being the providers of bond funding, raising money. And by the way, U.S. investors are desperate to make more investments in bonds because they get a break on their federal taxes for those bonds. So states could be planning engines, working with municipalities. Tiny towns, mid-sized towns can't possibly do this on their own. And there needs to be much more cooperation on a regional level to figure out where locuses, nodes of safer living might be possible, away from deltas, away from valleys that may flood. So I can imagine states in the middle of this political story, both having money and political will to plan more effectively for the future of their populace.
The Netherlands have come up a lot throughout this conversation as maybe an example for best practices that the U.S. might learn from. What are other regions that the U.S. is looking to, or do you have, you brought up the Southern Europeans and the wildfires there. Do you have people coming to you asking you how is California dealing with this? In general, do you find that there is an emerging global approach to this? Are countries learning from each other?
What I am noticing is that this entire subject has become very chic. Everybody is talking about the role of insurance markets, the role of public finance, the necessity for planning. It's definitely in the news, even if action is thin on the ground. As a topic for popular conversation, we're there. We're there because people really are noticing that either they can't get insurance. This is happening in the U.S., but in other parts of the world as well. They can't get insurance or it's too expensive. That's a signal. That's a signal that, in fact, it's becoming too risky to be in some places. The question is how the U.S. and other places, how everybody reacts to that, what they decide to do. And there, no country in the world is doing a great job. I have heard the vaguest of rumors, and I'm not an expert on this, and I wish I were, that China is actually better at this adaptation planning than we are. But it's useful being an authoritarian nation. You can just say, build a high-speed rail line here. Maybe you can shift where people live. Shanghai is hugely exposed. And much of the manufacturing sector or software development sector on the coast is exposed to sea level rise. So I need to learn more about that. But in my looking around the world, maybe Singapore, always an example of a city-state that is pretty good at planning. They have really tried to cope with it, both extreme heat and flooding, and planning ahead for sea level rise. There are elements of the New Zealand government that have really taken this on. But it's a challenge. This is a global, moral, ideological, existential crisis that we've never seen before. We can't look back to see how to cope with this. And it will continue forever. We've never had a policy problem like that. So that's why this is such an interesting area to work in, and where I hope there'll be lots of interest in the years to come.
Yeah, I'm sure. So at the end of the show, I like to ask our guests what book, what paper they would recommend to our listeners to better understand this. And I'm just going to jump in here and recommend both Susan's most recent report for Carnegie on flood insurance reform in the housing market, and also her excellent Substack, which is called Moving Day.
Moving Day. Oh, thank you, Sophia. Very kind of you.
But please, Susan, any other books, papers you want to put on the table?
Great. Well, thank you for the Substack link. I'm going to talk about my own book because I just can't help it. I spent these years on Charleston. The name of the book is Charleston, Race, Water, and the Coming Storm. It attempts to pull all these threads together for a particular place in the U.S., and I think makes for a page-turner. I also want to recommend The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh, who sees with the sweep of humanity the threat of climate change, the challenge it poses to our tiny human brains, and the unfairness that it causes, the really tumultuous effects on human beings' lives that all of this represents. This is not a bloodless issue. This is extraordinarily grief-filled, horror-filled, and Ghosh really conveys that in a beautifully written way.
Susan, it was a pleasure to have you on The World Unpacked. Thank you so
much. Thank you so much, Sophia.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Thanks to the excellent Hiwan Park, who is our audio engineer and executive producer, and to Cameron Zotter, who is our videographer. I'm Sophia Besch, Senior Fellow in the Euro Program and host of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.